mother was, the old mother, but the one child and holding in the plastic, that not he did it quite a lot. Where do you press this thing here?
I don't worry about it. We can drink this in. Give them my liker. Yeah. Yeah. Constantly. It's a very bad influence. You should get to know it. My wife only is when I'm doing something else that I can do. So that was why
Shall which the hell am I pressing this?
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour to be addressing you here tonight. It's not, as I live in France, it's not often I get to these august gatherings. Although in connection with my work with the Traditional Architecture Group and other organisations to do with traditional architecture, we do actually come here quite often. So my subject here tonight is Art Nouveau, which in some ways the Master has indicated does not altogether fit so squarely with the artwork and skills, but that's something I wish to talk about a little more. When it came up the idea that I was going to give a talk here tonight, I gave the Master 3 possible subjects, all completely different. One of them was Art Nouveau, and he chose that subject because he said it's beautiful. And that really is the best possible reason, and an absolutely true reason, why you would choose what is a true thing to say about Art Nouveau. I would never say that Art Nouveau buildings are the greatest in the world, the most important, but I would say, this is my opinion, that they're the most beautiful. Now, you may or may not agree with me, and I hope that from the slides I'm going to show you, you may start to see that perhaps I have a point. Now, the title of this talk is The Meaning of Art Nouveau, because very often it's regarded, I think, as being a collection of motifs. It's not really a movement with any great depth. And that is an idea that I'm going to try to dispel here tonight. And if we can understand that Art Nouveau has a meaning, it's not just a collection of motifs, then that means we can penetrate what it's actually about, and that gives us the opportunity, I believe, to build in the Art Nouveau style today, which I maintain is perfectly possible, and I'm going to show you at the end some examples of Art Nouveau buildings that are built today, including some sketches of my own. It's rather a strange fact about Art Nouveau is the distribution of where you find Art Nouveau and where it developed as a movement. And strangely, it did not develop in Britain. And in fact, I think I can say quite surely that there are no guildsmen of the past who have practiced Art Nouveau, who've built in the Art Nouveau style. And we heard the comments that the Master said about certain past masters had made about Art Nouveau. But although Art Nouveau did not start it in Britain, or was not practiced in Britain, there were things that happened in Britain before, and especially in England, that were very important to the development of Art Nouveau, absolutely crucial, that had an influence not only in this country but in America and on the continent. And on the continent, they became essential ingredients to the creation of the style. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Can we have some slides, please? So let's just start by having a review of what we're actually talking about. We all know what Art Nouveau is, but so let's have a little a view at some Art Nouveau buildings to identify the kind of characteristics that make up an Art Nouveau building. Now, so I'm going to flip through these fairly quickly. That's in Moscow. It's the Rybyshinsky Mansion, which you can see the swirling natural forms are part of that. Now, Nicholas Tesla said in 1936 that Art Nouveau was a short but very significant fashion in decoration. Now, that is a view that I hope that we can get past. It's far more than that. It could be very extravagant, as in this case in Spain. And what I would draw your attention to is the way in which the natural forms become integrated with the architectural forms. In Vienna, this is a secessionist building. The emphasis was slightly different. They're more geometric. That is Gaudi again, and we can see the desire to use colour, to use form, and in a way to undermine the purity of the architectural structure. That's an example from Hungary, rather a different style, very ceramic and very charming. And metalwork has always been integral to Art Nouveau. It conforms with one of the intentions of the Guild, as I understand it. The Guild wished to integrate the arts, and so it's very natural to create buildings that include painting, mosaic, sculpture, etc. And Art Nouveau does that like no other style, and this is a mosaic on a building in Brussels. There's different regional variations. This is an Italian variation, so it had a way also of including the heritage in the country where it was being built. That's Scotland, which that's actually ascribed to Charles Rennie Mackintosh, but really I believe that the design is more attributable to his wife Margaret MacDonald. And asymmetry is a very important element, not of all Art Nouveau buildings, but certainly a lot of them, a deliberate asymmetry. And also sculpture, as in this building in Prague. And it could work on big buildings in the town, in the city. It was very adaptable to those kind of buildings. And above all, you have a sense of the swirling forms, the curves, and also either the natural forms, the sense that nature is actually is breathing within the building structure. Now, this is just to state very briefly where Art Nouveau buildings occurred. The red areas are where Art Nouveau was very strong. The pink areas where it's not so strong. So Scotland is pink because there were only 4 Art Nouveau practitioners there. In Germany, it's strong in the south, not so strong in the north. But the main Art Nouveau nations are Spain, Belgium, France, Italy, Hungary, and Russia. Now, this is just a way of comparison to explain my thesis about how we can arrive at an understanding of what the Art Nouveau style was. Now, those areas on that map are the areas where the Baroque style was very, very strong. So France, Italy, Spain, same reasons as the Baroque style developed in the West, that is to say, to reinforce the authority of the church and also to create buildings that would have a great popular appeal. So you can see there's a correspondence, because the Baroque is actually very essential to Art Nouveau. And that would explain why there's nothing in England. We do have our English Baroque style, which is a very subdued version. And also, it would explain why Baroque never really crossed the Atlantic Ocean, not to the north, to the south, where you had a Catholic country. You could still get some Art Nouveau orientated buildings, but in North America, there are none. I would say there are none in England. Some people may find buildings they find that they consider exceptions. But my rule, and no one has ever yet really convinced me to the contrary, there are no Art Nouveau buildings in England and there are none in North America. Protestant countries, no Baroque, these things all go together. So the Baroque was essential to the Art Nouveau style. Now this is actually Watts Chapel, which is in England, which is sometimes cited as Art Nouveau. Well, it's very doubtful in my view. It's very close to art and crafts. Now, one way in which the guilds and the ideas behind the guild were very, very important to Art Nouveau, to the future of Art Nouveau, was the developments by William Morris and others. Now, Morris, I think, is absolutely a crucial figure in the history of art and architecture, and this is because he addressed the question of modernity. What is modernity? He could see that the world was changing, and so we needed to somehow address that in our art, in our architecture, and in our whole sense of design. And he was obviously very, very unhappy about the way in which the industrial society was dehumanizing work. And when he, in trying to formulate a response to modernity, he looked also to what was happening in architecture at that time. And what was happening, above all, was eclecticism. So you just picked a style and you used it, and maybe for not particularly good reasons. So it was very much a pick and choose situation. And Morris also wanted to humanize work as being very much a part of his philosophy, so that the art, for the creation of work, the creation of art, it's very important to see how the people who worked in those fields actually led their lives. And this is his factory, which is a complete contrast to the previous slide I showed. And so he developed his ideas of design. As I say, the primary thing that you have to understand is he was responding to the problems of the modern world. And he also produced his famous wallpapers, which were quite different from the very rigid, staid designs that had preceded his time. He tried to invest life and energy in a real sense of growing and a sense of real plants into his design. Now that's a theme that I will come back to, and in that sense Morris was a kind of proto-Art Nouveau designer in his wallpaper. And also an element that I want to feed into our understanding of Art Nouveau is the way in which people thought about myth and religion and the kind of stories that appealed to the popular imagination, because of course all part of modernity is that we were moving, society, civilization was moving into an era where the popular arts rather than the elite arts were going to play a bigger part. And so Morris became very interested in myth and folkloric tales, and in this he was very much working in the same vein as the typical Raphaelites, which of course he was very much connected. So this idea, this subject matter that art and architecture could approach was also very much something that came out of Morris and his circle. And with that came some quite important features, because that storytelling could easily introduction of eroticism and the sense of a lack of morality, which of course fought very much against the Moors of that time. And you find in so many of their works this kind of looseness that it's not really accepting what you're supposed to do in society, a kind of a sense of removal from society's pressures. And as we know, the actual winner in addressing modernity was not Art Nouveau, and it was not Morris in any real sense, but it was a completely different style of architecture. We're not going to look too much at that. So there are basically two responses to this quest for a modern style. And the architects and the people like Morris who addressed this problem, they had to look at what they had before them. Now, what they had before them was basically two types of architecture. They had the styled architecture of classicism, of Gothic, where the architect made a deliberate attempt to represent a pre-existing style, replicated and worked on its themes and its elements. And opposed to that, there was vernacular architecture, which came from quite a different background. Vernacular architecture, it was the architecture that was based on local materials, it was based on a very simple use of them, and did not attempt in any way to replicate any kind of styled architecture with all the baggage that goes with that. And so this was really, as far as Britain is concerned, this produced the arts and crafts movement, because they took vernacular architecture and used it to express something new. In a sense, there's a kind of conceit there, because although they were using vernacular elements, they actually went far beyond the intentions of the people who built vernacular architecture. This building by Prior shows it is a very, very exuberant building, but nevertheless is completely tied into its environment. And Bailey Scott, and this went through to the interior as well. So it was a whole sense of design. And it went to different countries. Once you start to build off the vernacular, you're inevitably tied to the country from which you're building. So it has what I would call a regional aspect. This is a building in Sweden. Some people call it the national romanticism. I prefer to call it simply regionalism. But the architect is working off what he found in the vernacular buildings around him. And this is a prairie school building from the Midwest of America. And the whole ethos behind prairie school architecture was to build something that was appropriate to the environment using local materials. And this is in Finland, the same idea. So this idea of building, of basing your architecture of the modern era, that as you perceived it, on the vernacular, happened in a lot of countries. It was always different because they were working off different themes. This is an example in Russia, which is taking very similar in some ways, to arts and crafts buildings in this country, except of course the elements they're picking up are from old Russian architecture, and they use these to adapt to a simplistic folkloric representation of how life could be. So that was one answer. This is the last slide showing arts and crafts, which to illustrate that it was actually more a movement of the countryside and of suburbia. It never really fitted into towns very well, and this is important. This is a building in Riding Street in London, which is one of the few successful arts and crafts buildings built in a town. And it's one of the few. There are not very many. It was never really worked as a response to building in urban situations. And that, I said that there's no Art Nouveau buildings in England. That is probably the nearest that you can get, this building, sorry, I forget the name of the suburb. Pardon? I can't hear. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. But that is probably near to Art Nouveau, but not exactly. Now, the second solution, so we've got this one solution, which is you work off the vernacular and you adapt it to each particular region or country that you're working in, and you create something really quite original and expressive from it. The other solution was to look at the buildings that were universal, that were based on universal styles. And the classical style was one, and where you had a vocabulary that you could adapt. And the important point is that this classicism is really universal style. It happens in all countries of Europe, in North America, and elsewhere. So it's not really reflecting the locality in which it's built. It's reflecting a grander, more universal idea. And what I would like to indicate to you about this style is that it uses elements from nature. So these columns are, to a degree, they resemble something you would find in nature, like a tree trunk, and they've got foliage coming out the top. It's not literally like a tree trunk, but I would say they're metaphorically, they're standing from the tree trunk. So you've got the use of nature, elements from nature, in order to build this style. And Gothic architecture is another pretty much universal style, certainly as far as Europe and North America is concerned. It just happened in most countries in Europe, or in Western Europe. And again, there is a sense that nature is there behind the forms, although in quite a different way in Gothic. I would say that in Gothic, you have the interiors, you have this sense that it's like a man-made forest. That's the kind of experience that it gives you. And the Victorians adapted this style sometimes to good effect, sometimes to not so good effect. Now, the important one for this discussion, where we're talking about Art Nouveau, is this universal style. It came from the universal styles. And the classicism had developed some centuries before, as we know, into Baroque. This is Borromini in Rome, where a certain kind of fluidity starts to appear into the designs, and so you lose the sense of rules governing each building, and it can become quite exuberant. And also very important for our understanding of Art Nouveau is that you started to use natural forms, in this case it's the human body, as architectural elements. And this is a building by Gaudi. It's not so well known because it's not one of his best buildings. But it's very interesting because it shows how Gaudi, who was primarily an Art Nouveau architect, at least as far as the buildings for which he's famous, also had looked very hard at Baroque architecture. And this is, I would say, is pretty well exactly a transitional building between a Baroque and Art Nouveau. It's not quite one or the other. That's the interior, and I would say that's probably the same comment would apply there. That's the building, not so very different, but I would say that's completely Art Nouveau. But you can still see that how Baroque has been in there informing the design style. And that's a kind of more mature Art Nouveau, in a sense where we don't have much classical reference, or we have a little bit in those columns, but there's moreover a sense of abandonment of the rules, and letting the structure release itself to a sense of the energy of nature. Now, I'm going to talk about the aesthetic movement briefly. I've explained how Morris's ideas were very important to Art Nouveau, and the questions that he asked about the way we should design were very important to the evolution of Art Nouveau, the Art Nouveau movement. Now, also very important, and again, it's an English development. It's not a continental development. It's almost a purely English development, although it did cross the continent, it crossed the Atlantic. But it's essentially, in English, the aesthetic movement. Now, the aesthetic movement brought in a very, very important principle that was going to influence Art Nouveau. And it was this principle, art for art's sake. So this was really revolutionary and very, very disturbing to a lot of people at the time, because art had always served a purpose. It was to express honor, it was to express glory, it was to express human values. It always had a purpose. But with the aesthetic movement, they abandoned all those purposes and said, look, art is just there for its own sake. In other words, it's there for its own beauty. So beauty becomes the most important fact in the development of buildings and other objects and furniture of the aesthetic movement. And this relates back to what I said right at the beginning, that Art Nouveau is about beauty. So this was a very important input of the aesthetic movement. The only thing that matters is beauty. Now, of course, the other side of the coin of that is that you can start to see it as very dangerous, because if beauty is the only thing that matters, then it's seen as being very narcissistic and abandoning morality. And Oscar Wilde expressed this absolutely beautifully in this quote I'm going to give you: nor in its primary aspect has painting any more spiritual message for us than a blue tile. It is beautifully coloured, it's a beautifully coloured surface, nothing more, and affects us by no suggestion stolen from philosophy, no pathos filtered from literature, no feeling filtered from a poet, but its own incommunicable artistic essence. Now, that doesn't sound too dangerous to us, but it sounds very dangerous to a lot of people at the time. And also it's accompanied by publications and really a production of all kinds of artifacts, a lot of which were sold at Liberties, which had opened at that time, and was very important in all designs. So it fed into a kind of lifestyle. Now that is a building by William Golding, who was not in the Art Workers Guild, but he's part of the aesthetic movement, and you can see just how close he came to producing an Art Nouveau building. But there was a reaction, because this movement looked rather licentious, and for a lot of people this was a problem. And in particular, it was a problem for Max Nordau. A very well-known book called Degeneration, and Degeneration was a big bestseller in its time, and it presented an image of a world out of our sense of morality, and we were losing the values that had developed. And he said in his book, the reddening light of the dusk of nations, in which mankind, with all its institutions, existed. See Oscar Wilde dancing and prancing in America, and that was the background. The physician recognizes at a glance in the fin de siècle disposition, in the tendencies of contemporary art, the confluence of two well-defined conditions of disease, with which he is quite familiar: degeneracy and hysteria. And it was very interesting when the master told me just before we came here of the quotes that had come from the masters, which were really very much along the same lines. And of course, this view was actually confirmed when you look at the Yellow Book and the illustrating. Well, who's to say? Yes, well, maybe it is a bit degenerate. What we can definitely say is abandoned any real of morality, or you could argue about that, but it's a sense it's amoral, and it's only interested in beauty. And with that goes a preoccupation with stories and myths that really have absolutely nothing to do with the standard religion macabre, and one of the myths or stories that very much preoccupied the aesthetic movement was that of Salome, with all its macabre and erotic implications built into this picture by deity. And the peacock the peacock feather became a symbol in a way, because it was just so totally superfluous. Why would a bird want all these feathers just to be beautiful? Very, very aesthetic movement. And Norbaugh also said another mental stigma of degenerates is their emotionalism. He feels the bliss of the beautiful possessing him to the tips of his fingers. And so you could certainly see that in some of their work. And another, not exactly reaction, but another trend in society that was there to deny the aesthetic movement and the ideas of Morris was the very strict scientism that was starting to take over the world in those days. I suppose one of the most important events of the late 19th century was the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. And so what they were doing was to say, well, we can explain nature. We don't need religion. We can explain evolution. We can explain how animal bodies work. And T.H. Huxley said, and this is 1867, zoological physiology regards animal bodies as machines impelled by forces which can be expressed in terms of ordinary forces of nature. And what he meant by that was by mechanical forces. And so it was a very reductive movement, and which is still very much with us, of course. I would say regrettably, but that's a matter of opinion. So it was seeing nature basically as a machine. We might not understand all the mechanics now, but one day we will. Now, on the other side of this excessive scientism, we have the anti-rationalists. And Nietzsche was a very important figure in this, and he was embraced what is called Laban philosophy. And the idea was, instead of analysing everything like philosophers had always done beforehand as an objective reality, what he said is that your philosophy should come out of your living. And so once you start to think like that, of course you tend to move away from rationalism, and you produce a rather unsystematic body of work. And also another anti-rationalist, but this time not a philosopher, but a scientist, was Hans Driesch, and he was absolutely opposed to Darwinism and Huxley. And he produced a theory called vitalism. Now, Driesch was a very, very well-respected scientist. He'd done important work on cell divisions, so he wasn't off the picture. He was very much part of the scientific community. And he said that there's more to it than this. There's an element in evolution, an element in life that we can't actually analyse as a machine, as Huxley said. He said the fundamental truth of vitalism is the irreducibility of the organic form. So there it is. You can only understand it as a whole. You can't reduce it. And ultimately, you have to understand nature of all types in terms of unreduced cells, which are elements that you cannot ever reduce without destroying them, but they can reproduce themselves. And in philosophy, another philosopher is usually allied with Laban philosophy is Henri Bergson, who is a Frenchman who was very, very popular, extremely well-read in his time, received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1926 for his book called Creating Evolution. And basically, what he said it's very similar in a way to what Hans Driesch said. He said that, look, what drives human beings, and what drives nature, what drives evolution, is a force that we can't understand. He called it the élan vital, or vitalism. It's a vital force. And they almost describe it as the lacuna in our knowledge. We can never see what it is, but at least they haven't attempted to pull it apart and say how it could all be explained. So when you look at a tree, you know that it's living. And this is where it starts to link up with Art Nouveau. You look at a tree and you know that that is a living object. No one could persuade you that it's dead. How do you know it as a living artist? Well, Bergson would say, you can see the élan vital coming through, expressing itself in that living being. You can't reduce it to a machine. And along with that went, importantly, the idea of metamorphosis. So one thing changes into another. An acorn becomes an oak tree. Well, try and explain that with your mechanical theories. Bergson said, look, you cannot do it. And everywhere you see metamorphosis and growing and effulgence in nature. Now, there's another, the Art Nouveau, as it was to be, had another ally which happened before Art Nouveau, and that was the symbolist movement. Now, again, symbolism didn't really happen in England and Britain, not as symbolism, but in a way it had already happened here, because the pre-Raphaelites and others are explored very similar territory. So symbolism developed in Belgium, France, and also very strongly in Russia and other countries. And so what is symbolism? Well, strange enough, the name is a misnomer because it doesn't actually symbolize anything. That's the whole point, is what they're trying to do is create pictures that introduce you to a reality that cannot be expressed any other way. Now you can see this totally contrasts with normal religion. And so frequently it made references to religion, maybe sometimes in a blasphemous way. And this picture probably alludes to the Last Supper. And so in this way, symbolism also got itself into big trouble with the moralizers of that time. And also, it seems, in retrospect, in some ways a bit like surrealism, but it's more than that because the intention is to actually express this reality that we have intuitive access to, that is really quite apart from the scientific world of Huxley and Darwin. And in Russia, it was very popular. The poets Andrei Bele and Alexander Blok are still read a lot in Russia, and there was symbolist paintings also produced in Russia. It was a very powerful movement there, and again, as I said, Art Nouveau is very powerful in Russia, so all these movements tend to go together. And again, with symbolism, it starts to address, go to territory that a lot of people would find questionable. And this is a portrait of a symbolist seen by a caricaturist. And this is again the Salome theme. I think you might say it's gone a bit over the top in addressing the charged potential of this story. And also they came into criticism. And this one contemporary commentator said, their vision has always been somewhat feverish, with the diseased sharpness of overexcited nerves. Again, it's the same kind of ideas that the past masters of the guild have, this idea of degeneracy, diseased. These were the themes that were around in those days. And you remember that people were very, very worried about their medical health at that time, because medicine was in its infancy, and medicine didn't really become respectable in the way that it is now until the invention of penicillin, which was some time off. And so the idea of disease and hysteria were themes that could easily be developed by certain writers. And also the other element that symbolism brought to Art Nouveau is often the sense of swirling curves, which you see in certain artists. And this I believe, fed also into Art Nouveau, because the kind of, as I think you come to see from what I say a bit later on, the ideas behind symbolism, what it meant, is there also in Art Nouveau. This is by Toulouse, one of the great symbolist painters. And now coming on to Art Nouveau, I mentioned the idea of metamorphosis that was associated with vitalism and Bergson. And I believe, this is coming to my main point, in order to define what the meaning is of Art Nouveau, which is the title of my lecture. So the meaning of Art Nouveau is that it embodies metamorphosis. And if we take this building by Gaudi, I would suggest it's no longer, as we saw with the classical building, or the Gothic building, where you've got architectural elements standing as in a metaphoric relationship with nature. Here, nature is actually coming into the building. The building is starting to transform itself into nature, and you don't quite see where the natural elements are and where the pure architectural elements are. And this is the essential idea of Art Nouveau, and you can see it in all Art Nouveau buildings everywhere. In Gaudi particularly powerfully. This is the Tassel House in Belgium, which is normally reckoned to be the first Art Nouveau building in 1893 by Victor Orta. And again, he's introducing natural elements into the pure architectural form. This is by Guimard, and again, that isn't by Gaudi. It looks very much like it, but it's another Barcelona architect. Again, the architectural elements, the columns, they are losing their relationship to architecture and suggesting a drift to style, to nature. And one of the interesting things about Art Nouveau, the way Art Nouveau represents nature, is they don't actually concern themselves with species, whereas Morris did. In the wallpaper I showed, they're identifiable species, because the Art Nouveau architects and designers, what they were interested in is not species, not depiction, not as naturalists depicting nature. What they're interested in is this vital thought in nature and expressing it in their buildings. And this is from Austria, which is a slightly different way of doing it, but the integration of the human figure into the architecture, which we saw in the Baroque. This is a kind of transitional building again between Baroque and Art Nouveau. And it worked in different ways. This is in Hungary, which developed its own national, very, very specific Art Nouveau style. And again, it has the same intention of bringing nature and this idea of vitalism into the building elements. And it was always, metalwork was always very important to Art Nouveau, for the simple reason that if you want to represent a planned form, there's no better material than metal in order to create the what they call the whiplash form that suggests growth and a living organism. And so metalwork is very important, as are many other arts. This could work on the surface, as this is Austria. It's the same idea of breaking down and denying the kind of objectivity of the building elements and showing how they can approach nature. And you can see, typical ways they had of achieving this. Here, the window is turned into an organic, round-looking form, and so you read it, and you see this sense that the building is being taken over by nature. I think these all illustrate the same point from different countries. That's Italy, which has its own particular type of Art Nouveau. Now, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but but I want to just go quickly. How are we doing? Yeah. So I will go through different countries just to show you the different forms of Art Nouveau and how it's expressed in different places. So this is Belgium, which is where you have the first Art Nouveau buildings, technically the first, but they followed on very quickly elsewhere. And I would say that the reason for that is because the elements that contribute to the creation of Art Nouveau were already there in lots of places. So the fact that it started in Belgium, I think, is fairly haphazard. It could have begun anywhere, because the elements I've talked about of symbolism, of the Baroque, did exist in a lot of different countries. Not all countries, but the ones where Art Nouveau was subsequently developed. And this is Orta again. I mentioned about the integration of all the arts into Art Nouveau buildings, which is really absolutely a skilled precept, I would say, and I don't think there's any other building style that you can say that does this better than Art Nouveau. All the arts come into play to create an Art Nouveau building: metalwork, stained glass, sculpture, everything is there. That's the castle house from the outside. I think we've seen that one. And also a symmetry. Not all Art Nouveau buildings are asymmetrical, but often a symmetry is used as a deliberate way of expressing the presence of nature as an element in the design, because of course nature does like symmetry sometimes, but sometimes it totally disregards symmetry, and Art Nouveau buildings do much the same. Again, this is the way we see the integration of all the arts into an Art Nouveau building. France, very similar in some ways to Belgium. It had its own unique genius in Hector Guimard, whereas Belgium had Victor Orta, and Guimard was really one of the absolute great architects, I think. He did the Metro, as I expect most of you know. What is probably not so well known is that of 22 or so that he did, they only preserved about 9. They were ripped out quite wantonly by the Paris authorities. This is Hector Guimard again, and he slightly slides into a folksy pattern on the roof. And this is another building by him which was destroyed, a very magnificent hallway, and he is using very much organic form to express this big structure. Scotland. Mackintosh, this is a building by Mackintosh. It's not really Art Nouveau in any sense. I would say it's a pure arts and crafts building. That, an interior element, is instantly recognizable as Mackintosh. And I think there's no question that he was a genius. But he was also, I think, very much helped by his wife, Margaret MacDonald, who is not always given the credit that she deserves. And that's a painting purely by Margaret MacDonald, who did lots of absolutely wonderful work. Spain, one of the great Art Nouveau countries. We see Gaudi. I won't spend too much time talking about these. I'll let you enjoy the images. But this is Gaudi. Interestingly, Gaudi didn't like normal door heights. And so when he built doors in a significant place, he often built a much bigger opening, and then the door was set in. I think he's got a point there. Spain again, where we're using the mosaic on the outside to decorate the building. This is by Gaudi. Really incredible sense of what you can achieve with cast iron. I don't know how he instructed people to build that, but he did. And Art Nouveau in Spain could sometimes drift to Gothic, with largely mixed results, I would say. Italy. Now, Italian Art Nouveau is not so well known, not because there isn't lots of it, but because a lot of it is privately owned houses, and it's not very accessible. This is one building that is, I think that's in Milan. That's a private house that I don't know how accessible that is, but it's a general problem in Italy. That one's obviously you can see from the road. Quite simple design really, but they absolutely achieve the expression of, I would say, of vegetable growth in that building. I mean, if you take, for instance, there's certain, you might say, not exactly tricks, but you use elements to suggest how this could be. For instance, if you look at this, the vertical elements that go up through the gutter, and what they're doing is that they're giving you a vertical element. It's actually denying what's happening on the structure. And this is a kind of device that is used by a lot of Art Nouveau buildings to create this sense of growth. And this is just the pure exuberance of the design which is creating that sense. For Austria, I think they have mostly drawings because they did these beautiful drawings. It's normally not called Art Nouveau in Austria, it's called Secessionist, and I think there's a good reason, is that it's not really quite Art Nouveau. It's absolutely brilliant, absolutely wonderful, and it's clearly associated with Art Nouveau with some of the same ethos, but it's really, I think it stands apart. And Macintosh was very well appreciated and known about in Austria, and I think you can see the influences there. Hungary, one of my favourite Art Nouveau countries, it's got its own unique style. The big figure in Hungary is Oda Lechner. I don't know if I've got any pictures by him, because there's so many other Art Nouveau architects that were producing this brilliant original stuff. And they love to work with ceramics. And by working in ceramics, one of the things they achieved was a kind of more folkloric quality. And this was absolutely deliberate because Art Nouveau in Hungary, the Art Nouveau architects wanted to express something of their nation, of the uniqueness of Hungary. And it was just at the time when it was still the dual monarchy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been established, and the Hungarians were very keen to show their difference. And the Art Nouveau buildings were very much an expression of their own uniqueness as a nation. And they were very, very successful. And they produced, unlike in a lot of countries, some big buildings. There's a lot of big Hungarian Art Nouveau buildings. Slightly less, the emphasis with Hungary is on the smaller elements rather than the big gesture of as you see with, for instance, Gaudi. And they use the details of the building to enhance this sense that nature was an ever-present thought, and that you could use that to enliven and inform the architecture. And there's lots of this stuff. Beautiful. Well deserved as well. And that looks to me like a pretty difficult thing to create in ceramics. Hungary again. Still Hungary. Absolutely superb, colourful works. And look at that. That's quite a nice commission. Not sure what that building is, but it's a pretty good commission. There was a lot of confidence given to the Art Nouveau designers in Hungary. And look at that for workmanship. Don't know what those materials are on the column, but my goodness, it's very well handled. I I think this is Lechner, and I don't know how you design ceramics to sit up on the top of a building like that, exposed to all the elements in such thin, graceful forms, but it's still there. And colour and the folkloric sense very much integral to Hungary. Absolutely superb stuff. Russia probably, I would say, has more Art Nouveau buildings than any other country. It was very, very popular in Russia. You might say, well, okay, it's a big country, which it is, but if you take the west of Russia, which is what we're concerned with when we talk about the Art Nouveau, it's quite astounding the number of Art Nouveau buildings there are. Russian Art Nouveau tends to be less extreme, and often there's a lot of buildings there which don't seem terribly Art Nouveau, but they aren't anything else. They've got Art Nouveau elements, and I love it very much. This is the Hotel Metropole, which is right by the Red Square. So it's an Art Nouveau, a major, big Art Nouveau building right in the center of Moscow, between the Bolshoi Ballet building and Red Square. So it's a very significant building in Russia, and there was a very important group of artisans and craftsmen based in an artist colony called Brother, and they were involved in this building because it was built by a very enlightened patron, and this is work by the very great Russian painter called Rudolf. That's the inside, quite pleasant. And there you can see just how close it is to the centre of Moscow. And the most important Art Nouveau architect in Russia was a man called Fyodor Shekhtov, and this was one of his more restrained buildings, but a very, very elegant, beautiful building, I would say. And he also built that, which is the Yaroslav railway station. And one of the things that you get in Art Nouveau, rather similar but different to what I explained in Hungary, is you get elements of old Russian architecture. It starts as trying to express something uniquely Russian, and this beautiful building, which that's an old photograph, but it's pretty much the same now on the outside. And the use of national elements in order to create an expression for in this case, I think it was for the Moscow voice, but you're getting into rather complicated politics there. But remember that the Tsar was up in St. Petersburg, and that left Moscow much freer to do what it wanted. So it was a very liberated place in many ways, but also in the Art Nouveau architecture that it produced. And that's really quite delicate. It could be like English arts and crafts almost. And again, reusing elements from folk architecture or vernacular architecture. And as I said, Russian Nouveau, it's not always terribly powerful, but it's just there informing the building. I like that very much. It introduces a very important element into the architecture of Moscow. And although the Art Nouveau might be slightly more muted in other countries, it's very, very widespread. There's a lot of it. So it's rather unlike in other countries where you have your Art Nouveau masterpiece, and then a lot of other stuff around. In Moscow, it's just everywhere. And this is the kind of another element that fed into Russian Art Nouveau, which is the Neo-Russian movement, which was interested in going back to the vernacular and early church architecture of Russia. And this is the Tretyakov Gallery, which is probably one of the best examples of this integration of Neo-Russian, Old Russian architecture and Art Nouveau. Very handsome facade, I would say. And they could be quite adventurous with integrating Art Nouveau with other elements, and that's a very fine example in Moscow. Now, so coming towards the end now, let's ask the question, why did it die? Because I think you could say it did die. With the First World, after the First World War, there was practically no Art Nouveau buildings built. And just to give a few pointers as to what happened, this is in Spain, which was so important to developing and a very exuberant Art Nouveau, developed what they call the Nouveau Centrisme movement. It's the new century, and with that came a return to more classical, more regular type of buildings, of which this is an example. It's not a bad building, it's a good building, but it's not exciting in the way that Art Nouveau buildings, and so this is another building in that category where they return to classicism. They're nice buildings, but they're not Gaudi and the other Art Nouveau architects of Spain. And this is a building by Schechtel, who I mentioned, for the same client which he did the Rubinstein Mansion. This is the Rubinstein Bank, and obviously really a played down type of architecture was considered suitable. And this was starting to happen at the beginning of the 20th century. So as in Spain, there was this kind of movement towards more classical, simple buildings. And this is actually Schechtel's own house, which is clearly becoming very spared down and slightly austere, I would say. To take another example of an architect that continued, an Art Nouveau architect that continued to work late into the 20th century, this is a building by Victor Orta, who you remember built the first Art Nouveau building in 1893 in Tasselhouse. This is a building in Tournai, a very attractive town in Belgium, and he built a Musée des Beaux-Arts there, and it's still got the old Horta elements, but you can see that it's become more classical, even neoclassical, but very pleasant, excellent, beautiful building, and Horta still on good form. This is another building by Schechtel, where he's losing the Art Nouveau, but it's still in there, and he's moved more towards what is called the Neo-Russian style. And the Neo-Russian style it was quite vigorous, and would have continued, I'm sure, if it hadn't been for the revolution in the First World War. Now, there was another element that I think worked against Art Nouveau, there was a strong return to jingoism in the early 20th century, and this jingoism was eventually to lead to the tragedy of the First World War. Nations were feeling very insecure, they were becoming very dominated by the military, and in Britain that meant a return to what was considered a uniquely British style, so they went back to the Baroque of Wren's time in the late 17th century, and so we had a revival of Baroque. They're not bad buildings, but I think they're rather heavy and not very inspiring. But behind that, I am sure, was the search for something that was uniquely Britain, and it fed into this very nationalistic fervour that many nations fell into in the lead-up to the First World War. Another way that you could say that Art Nouveau continued, or a way that you could say Art Nouveau continued, was in Art Deco. Now, a lot of people say that Art Deco came from Art Nouveau. I don't really go with that quite, because for me, the sources that created Art Deco are quite different. I spoke about the Baroque in Art Nouveau. To me, the sources for Art Deco are what I would call pagan elements, Egyptian architecture, or a very geometric forms that you could find in primitive cultures, African cultures in various parts around the world. It's quite a different aesthetic, and interestingly, although there was no Art Nouveau in the USA, Art Art Deco became the American style. And it started in France, but really it was America adopted it all for its own and put it into popular culture, and the kind of ziggurat forms are all what I would say it came from people looking at pagan elements in architecture. It also could be slightly Gothic, Gothic rather than Baroque, and I think this sort of explains something about the nature of Art Deco. So a lot of people do say, well, Art Deco was inherited the mantle of Art Nouveau. I'm not so sure about it. Art Nouveau today, well, this is where I bring the story up to date. In a way, in the 1960s in this country, Art Nouveau was brought in, was adopted as a kind of style of the 60s, presumably because what was important to the 60s was the sense of liberation. And Art Nouveau, as I explained, already very much had that embodied in the style. And so Bieber, the successful shop of that time, took up Art Nouveau and made it emblematic of its style. And I think since that day, Art Nouveau's always stayed with us. People know what it is, whereas probably before the Second World War, before the 1960s, I think probably people, a lot of people simply never heard of it. Now, to bring us right up to date, there aren't many people actually producing Art Nouveau buildings. This is probably the best practitioner. He's a man called Oleg Carlson, who works in Moscow, and he has got a very kind of sound grip on the style, in my view. It's quite original, and also it copies a lot, and he can really handle the elements. Some people accuse his work of being slightly bling. That may be so, but he gave the client what they wanted, which was absolutely superb mansion. And he, like a good Art Nouveau architect, he can work on the style at all different levels on the furniture and the interior fittings. And I think it's a very excellent example. That was completed in 2012. So really, it's proving the point I mentioned at the beginning, is I'm trying to make that we could build Art Nouveau today. I won't listen to people who say you can't. People say, oh, it's all too expensive. Lots of buildings are expensive these days because the architects do funny tricks with the concept, which are inherently expensive. Art Nouveau architecture looks expensive to some people because the money, you can see the money being spent. You can see where the money went. And then, so that's very good for a committee, because they say, look, we can chop out that bit of panel, we can chop out those mosaics, and we'll save some money. Which is obviously a quite wrong way of doing it. That's a little cinema. Again, it's in Russia, because as I say, Russians are very strong on Art Nouveau, and so really I think it's probably fair to say that that is where the Art Nouveau movement of today is surviving. Now, I said that there is no Art Nouveau buildings in the USA. This is a recent restaurant, I think in Atlanta, which is Art Nouveau. So I was quite surprised to see this, and it's a very creditable piece of interior design. So that's probably the first Art Nouveau building on the North American continent, and I think it was built 2 years ago. And this is another, I don't know if the people I invited came here tonight, but they are some artist blacksmiths that work in this country, and they are working in what I would call an Art Nouveau style, but being quite adventurous with it. And I think it's very encouraging, I think, to see blacksmiths, artist blacksmiths, not to shun the Art Nouveau style. And in fact, as I said, metalwork and Art Nouveau very much go together. And now I'm going to just take you briefly, just to finish up, with some of my own designs. Now, show you. I always choose specific sites for these buildings. I want to build kind of a new classical building with an Art Nouveau input. And one of the things that's always kind of, I'm not a classical architect, and it sort of slightly bothers me the way the column goes up to the top and then the capital is placed on the top like another element. And so they don't integrate together. So that's what I was trying to do with what I call this order liberté. It's a new architectural order where the column actually runs in to the capital, and at the base you can take this symbolism seriously or not. At the base you have this kind of pod which is all the seed from which the thing grows. That's the way I saw it. You don't have to look at it. And so that was it's quite a big scheme, but that was just one part of it, one facade that I produced using this new Art Nouveau order. And I designed some of the elements to go with it. This stuff I'm showing you is all totally buildable. There's nothing very complicated there. I couldn't imagine building a building like Gaudi. I can't imagine how he got the building. I wouldn't have a clue about how you would realise a building like that in reality. But you can realise Art Nouveau buildings. And this was the design I did for Toulouse, which I like being commissioned, except it wasn't a commission. But this is for an opera house. And there's kind of a lot of Art Nouveau stuff I've been looking at, and also secessionist elements in this building. And again, it's using all the art, sculpture, painting has to come in to make this up. And that's the staircase, which I don't like opera very much, but I like the business of going to the opera, so to me the staircase is sort of very important. And so that's how that looks. That's the stage. It's slightly Rococo, because I haven't mentioned Rococo, I've mentioned Baroque a lot, but Rococo also is obviously strongly allied with Baroque, but a lot of Rococo elements come into Art Nouveau as well. You can have fun with this, making up the friezes. And with the chimneys, as a traditional architect, I must have chimneys on my buildings, because I think you need to break the skyline and touch the sky. And just to bring you right up to date, that's a sketch. This is for another site, actually in Paris. Stresses my imaginary commissions. I just do them because I like working on the stuff. And this is what I call the Rococo Nouveau style. And you might say that, if the modernists like to talk about cutting edge of modernism, I would say this is where we go with the cutting edge of Art Nouveau. And that's the Rybczynski mansion where I had the privilege to give a talk last summer 2015, and standing there on this absolutely wonderful staircase. So, thank you.
Would anybody like to ask Peter any questions? Remembering to stand up. Okay. Wow, you're all stunned. Gentleman at the back.
My name's Master David Birch. I wonder if the inability of Art Nouveau to adapt and change and move on with the times is in some way a major contributor to its demise. And looking at the modern Art Nouveau examples that leaves room for a truly progressive move forward from the principles of Art Nouveau that were set down at the end of the 1800s.
Well, I would say yes, there are. I mean, the big element that I didn't mention in my talk, it was the triumph of modernism. Now, modernism came about with the First World War and the great upheaval and the sense that people. I think people after the First World War felt there was a need for something new, and the modernist architectural movement was very successful in presenting itself as the movement of the future. And it became, bit by bit, dominant. In Europe, it arrived first. In America, it didn't really arrive till after the Second World War. But I would say that, to answer one part of your question, I think it was the triumph of modernism which actually did for all traditional architecture. Now, as I tried to argue, for me, Art Nouveau is traditional architecture. Because it addresses the problems of how to design in the modern age. And William Morris, for instance, who wasn't an Art Nouveau architect, but he was very much on the arts and crafts side, he always used the word modernity and modern, but the modernists, they kind of hijacked that word. And I would say modernism is a cult of modernity, whereas William Morris was addressing the problems of modernity. And I think traditional architecture today is addressing the problems of modernity. And for me, Art Nouveau is, I'm involved with the traditional architecture movement in a couple of ways. And to me, Art Nouveau is just part of that return to traditionalism. I'm not saying that it's the only one, it's just one option. Now, you say that the recent buildings look like pastiches. I don't agree. To me, a pastiche is when it's badly done, when it's got no heart in it. Obviously, you can use elements, even steel elements from other buildings. I don't see anything wrong with that. Classical architects do it all the time. They just copy, and vary it slightly. And I think that you can do the same thing with the architect, with the Art Nouveau style. I mean, in the building that I designed, you just saw the opera, the staircase actually is not a pastiche of anything. That I know. That is completely original. It's the same is true for a lot of elements on that building. Certain ones are, I've taken from other ones. I would say they're not pastiches because they are correctly used with the right emphasis and combined with the other elements in an authentic way. Now, that's just a judgment. And I would make the same comment about the Oleg Carlson's buildings in Moscow, that they are actually they are very well done. Now, I also very strongly believe, and this applies to all traditional architecture at the moment, is that what we're trying to do is to reinvent traditional architecture, because architects really lost their way in the 20th century. Real architecture wasn't taught, it isn't being taught now. We're going back and starting again. And we may not, get a mature article straight away. I think that we have to work at it. And so whatever doubts you might have about what you've seen of Art Nouveau buildings of today, I would suggest that this is the start of a process, and we have to put faith in that. We cannot stick to the bankruptcy and the sterile architecture of modernism we've got to go back to traditionalism. And I'm not saying Art Nouveau is the only way by any means. I'm just saying that it is one of the elements that we need to revisit and redevelop in the future.
Thank you very much. Sorry, yeah, one last question.
Well, I just rather like the same, so I just wanted to thank you for a very exhilarating lecture. And I particularly enjoyed the fact you brought in all these wars in philosophy between reductionists and the like Bergson. And that, in fact, had huge influence in England. People like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were very influenced by John Bergson. Is that his name? The French.
Bergson.
Yeah.
I didn't hear your name. Was it C.S. Lewis, you said?
C.S. Lewis and Tolkien.
Oh, Tolkien, yeah.
They were very influenced by those ideas. And in a sense, one could argue that a spiritual Art Nouveau, although it didn't have the architectural embodiment thing, it did go into literature. And certainly, I think Tolkien embodies that.
Well, as I said, I think that in some ways England was ahead of the game because the pre-Raphaelites, which were working, I think, in the 1850s, really they got on to some of the elements that were to reappear in symbolism, and so that sensibility was in Britain as well. But also, although we didn't actually produce any Art Nouveau buildings, I would say, we actually produced a lot of Art Nouveau artifacts. I've got a wonderful book about Art Nouveau, from Macintosh to Liberties, and it's about the textiles, the objects, where there were a lot of genuinely Art Nouveau artifacts produced. So, as you quite rightly point out, although it didn't catch on as an architectural style, the sensibility and the Art Nouveau design did exist here. I mean, in America, the one Art Nouveau practitioner that you could say without a doubt was Louis Comfort Tiffany, but he wasn't a homegrown product exactly, because he trained in Paris and went back to New York and produced his designs for lampshades and other things in an Art Nouveau style. So I think that, as you say, Art Nouveau was there in certain areas that doesn't actually find its way into buildings.
Peter, thank you very much. I mean, that's been an amazing, it's obviously a vast subject, and we've only just scratched the surface of it this afternoon or this evening. I'm kind of reminded as well of the lovely Kay Fassett when he sat here and he said, for him, more is more. And that's for me the same, I have to say. I just love it. I just love the ornament and the exuberance, really. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Guild for a really entertaining and very interesting talk. Thanks very much.
You need a drink after that, I expect.
Yes.
Last one, Mike, is it?
Thursday, yeah. Carry on. That's the wine. Carry on with that. That's fine.
Yeah, fine.
Thank you very much indeed. I've been following with traditional architecture for a little while now. I used to work for Steve Langer Research. Yes, now work with Guy Goodfellow. I'm going to get you quite a song once we started. Well, I could do it. Yeah, absolutely. Nice. Not too many.
No.
Well, I don't mind. Okay. And now I work with Guy Goodfellow, who was the Colfax and Fowler. Colfax and Fowler. Sybil Colfax and John Fowler, interior designers and architects. I was going to ask a question.